Hello again. It's great to see you. Thanks for tuning in. Things have been a little all over the place with me, but I'm excited to get back into making more videos with more consistency. So, thanks for sticking around. So, I watched the Amy Winehouse movie Back to Black a few weeks ago, and I came away from it feeling pretty conflicted about what I saw on screen and the portrayal of Amy. This is a pretty common reaction from what I've seen online, so I wanted to read a few of the books written by her friends and family members in order to get a better idea of what the movie was supposedly portraying and whether or not it did so successfully. So I read the books Mitch Winehouse's Amy, My Daughter, Janice Winehouse's Loving Amy, A Mother's Story, and her best friend Tyler James's book, My Amy, The Life We Shared. Something I made note of in my video about the Elvis biopics is just how complicated it is to tell somebody's life story and how many unreliable narrators there are. Someone can tell their own life story with as many glaring inaccuracies as their family members or friends telling it. So really all you can do is, without experiencing it for yourself, is gather as much information as possible from varied sources and draw your own conclusions. I first came across Amy Winehouse with her songs Back to Black and Rehab, two huge hits, and Back to Black was a song that I had in rotation on repeat in middle school and high school because of how powerful that song is. But I didn't realize then that she only released 2 albums while she was alive. And when I first listened to them all the way through, they sounded so fully formed and mature that I was surprised that these were her first public contributions to music. And it sounded like she'd been making music for decades. So, a quick summary of the movie for those who have not seen it yet. The movie begins with Amy Winehouse running down the street while her entrance essay to the Sylvia Young Theatre School is being read aloud. In the essay, she talks about wanting people to hear her voice and forget her troubles for a little while. She's writing and performing songs at the time, she performs her song Stronger Than Me at a pub, and she attracts the attention of Island Records and 19 Management thanks to an introduction by her friend Tyler James. She's given a record deal and £200,000. She releases her first album, Frank, an album she recorded in Miami and New Jersey, inspired by her favorite jazz songs. She wins a Brit Award for the album and is recognized in the UK as a new musical talent to watch. But her label tells her that while Frank did well critically in the UK, she would not be getting a US release. They also tell her that she should change up her performances and stop playing guitar to improve her stage presence. She expresses to them that her performance anxiety often holds her back and that the label's criticisms really discourage her. She's day drinking in a pub when she meets Blake Fielder-Civil, who is someone this movie focuses on entirely regarding Amy's life and who is essential in the framing of her death. Blake was in another relationship when they met, but that didn't stop either of them. They quickly become obsessed with each other, and they fall in love. They spend all of their time together, they even get tattoos of each other's names, but things go sour when she strikes Blake after an argument and scratches him. Blake breaks up with her over their violent fights and her drinking, and Amy enters into a depression where her drinking really spirals and she hurts herself when she's drinking alone. Her manager Nick attempts to convince her and her dad to accept that Amy needs help and go to rehab. But her dad disagrees. Amy then drops Nick as a manager and hires Ray Cosbert instead. Amy goes to New York to record Back to Black, and her grandmother dies while she's away. At her grandmother's funeral, Amy is very thin, and her father remarks on it, but Amy blows him off. Amy falls into a deep depression after the death of her grandmother and tries crack for the first time alone, in addition to her heavy drinking. Blake texts Amy to get back together with her after Blake's dealer pushes him to reconcile with her due to how much money Blake owes him for heroin. Amy and Blake get back together, and they go to Miami to elope without telling her family. Amy and Blake do crack together on their honeymoon, and their violent fights begin again, but this time with paparazzi capturing photos of the two of them with scratches and blood on their faces while running down the street. Amy and Blake spend most of their time together, usually in her bedroom, trying to stay away from the paparazzi that have set up camp outside. They're hanging out in their place, talking about starting a family and even trying for a baby, until the cops burst in to arrest Blake on assault charges. He's imprisoned, and Amy is extremely upset. Amy brings up Blake's arrest at her subsequent concerts, dedicating songs to him and talking to the crowd about waiting for her husband to get out. Amy visits Blake in Pentonville prison, where he tells her that he's sober and has been seeing a therapist who has described their relationship as toxic and codependent. And he then asks Amy for a divorce. Amy leaves the prison with her dad and decides not to tell him what Blake said, but she does ask him to take her to rehab. She spends time in rehab all up until her broadcast performance at the Grammys, where she wins 5 Grammys. While Amy is still drinking, she is no longer doing drugs. She moves into her last house in Camden and is walking outside when paparazzi tell her that Blake now has a child with his new girlfriend. Amy stops and noticeably bristles and then goes back inside. And then the movie ends with a black screen noting the date of her death and the fact that she died from alcohol poisoning. So I think the movie Back to Black started the story too late, and it focused on the wrong moments. I didn't see anything but a highlight reel of Amy performances with some Amy Blake fanfiction mixed in. There's a real lack of an origin story here, as they began with Amy being sought out by 19 Management, and it doesn't really feel like that's where her story began. It also feels like, despite what the director has said, Sam Taylor Johnson, she used Mitch Winehouse's book as a guide to the movie plot. Now let's explore what the books tell us about Amy's life and how they match up to the portrayal in the movie Back to Black. Amy Winehouse was born September 14th, 1983 in Enfield, London, to Janice and Mitch Winehouse. Janice was a pharmacy tech and Mitch was a window pane installer. She also has an older brother named Alex, who is 4 years older than her. Amy's parents divorced when she was 9 years old, when her father Mitch left Janice for a woman that he met at work named Jane. Both Janice and Mitch have written in their books that they had no idea how much their divorce affected Amy and Alex, and it was only until they were in their 20s that they revealed that for them it was a huge surprise that the divorce happened because they'd never heard their parents even so much as fighting. Janice is a very soft-spoken mother and was completing her bachelor's degree at the time of the separation and divorce, so she put her energy into work and school rather than an emotional outpouring. Janice wrote that she expected that Mitch had been with someone else because he was often away for work. But just like we discussed unreliable narrators, there is a point in Janice's book where she says Amy in an interview talked about how she'd seen her mother crying after her father left and that it left a really strong impression on Amy. Janice says that she thinks Amy must have made it up because she doesn't remember ever breaking down and crying over the divorce. And now it's possible that Amy lied, but it's also possible that Janice just doesn't remember. According to Tyler James, Amy was smoking weed and drinking as early as 12 years old as a way of coping with an existence where she disliked her home life with divorced parents and silently struggled with depression and body dysmorphia. She also hated her new stepfather, a man named Tony. They all moved in together when she was in high school, and they were so polar opposite that she would often just stay in her room rather than interact with him and his kids, who are around Amy and Alex's ages. Amy got into music through her parents and grandparents who loved jazz, and her mom had broad tastes and loved Carole King and Prince. One of Amy's favorite songs was Carole King's So Far Away. She would sing it to Tyler for him to fall asleep. Amy would sing with her dad a lot, who also wanted to be a singer when he was younger, and her mom wrote about how Amy would sit on the ledge of her window and sing out towards the street when she was 13 years old. Janice also talked about how her sister was a singer, and every time she would sing, she would be clutching the hem of her dress, just like how Amy performed. It was obvious that Amy loved to sing from a young age. She got into community theater when she was 9 years old while attending the Susie Earnshaw Theater School, and she really enjoyed it. And there are performances online even of her in her school's production of Grease as Rizzo, which feels so fitting. In Janice's book, she discusses Amy being disinterested in school and structure, being extremely intelligent but bored easily, seeking stimulation often, ignoring work and missing deadlines, and engaging in risky behavior like piercing her own ears in the back of a classroom. She talked about the recording of Frank and how, as much as Amy loved to sing and make music, Amy would have a really hard time focusing and working in the studio. And at one point, the label had to install studio equipment in Amy's room just to encourage her to record music. Now, I'm only saying this as someone diagnosed with ADHD, but a lot of what Janice describes is pretty textbook ADHD behavior. Going untreated for ADHD is really difficult and comes with a lot of negative labels like lazy and stupid, and not knowing what's wrong with you and why you can't sit down and focus or work the way others do is a pretty big mindfuck. This isn't a diagnosis ever discussed in these books or by Amy herself, so there's no other evidence that she had it. It's just an observation I'm making. Her mother also describes Amy being domineering in school and how she could be a bully. She had a hard time making friends. Janice wrote about how during one end-of-year school event, her classmates had signed a shirt for Amy with a lot of insults, and a family friend threw the shirt away before Amy got home for her mother to see it. Amy veered between playing the class clown to being spiteful and domineering, and, if I'm honest, a bully. As a last day of term ritual, all the children would sign one another's t-shirts as a memento of their time there before they graduated to secondary school. What I didn't know is that Amy's shirt had been signed with the most hateful insults. My friend Stephanie had picked Amy up that day. Having taken one look at what had been scrawled on the white material in indelible ink, she had thrown the shirt in the bin before I could see it. Fellow mums and friends would always try to protect me from the full force of Amy out of kindness, and I'm grateful for that. But the bottom line is, I was her mother, and I knew in my heart that Amy was an angel and devil rolled into one. Billie Piper, a classmate at the Cynthia Young School, gave an interview about going to school with Amy and seeing her deal with bullying. She was always cheeky. She was always like that, you know. She would do abstract stuff, and I really loved it, Piper recalled, adding she could do everything. Super clever, super bright, she was unlike any other girl at that school. However, Piper said that Winehouse's time at school wasn't the easiest ride, as she got bullied quite a lot at school because she was doing her own thing, and she liked to push buttons and do weird stuff. I wish Amy's insecurities and anxieties were discussed more because of how her substance abuse was, in her own words, self-medication. She's also not someone who grew up considering therapy or mental illness treatment as a serious option, though she was on antidepressants for a time as a teenager. Amy Winehouse also struggled with bulimia starting at about 15 years old, and growing up and discovering her sexuality and also new insecurities about her body, it is so understandable how Amy would arrive at an eating disorder, especially when there is a concerning account by her mother indicating that Amy brought up her bulimia to her parents as simply a diet that keeps the pounds off, and they chose to ignore it in the hopes that she would outgrow it. I'm not here to shame her parents. Parents make mistakes, and parents of that generation, much like my own parents, held different ideas about mental illness and the behavior of children. Letting them grow out of it is not unheard of even today, though that was an incredibly dangerous thing to do, especially considering the long-term damage that bulimia had on her body. The descriptions of Amy's relationships and her autobiographical writing leave an impression that her sense of self-worth was not great. And this is not an insult. I'm saying that she was extremely self-critical, self-sabotaging, and self-deprecating. She would often use self-deprecating humor to kind of laugh off her insecurities, but she still felt those insecurities deeply. Amy Winehouse also had a history of self-harm that really indicated to me a lack of coping mechanisms and a need for treatment. Not everyone who self-harms is suicidal, but the self-harm is kind of a displacement of pain and is a pain controlled by the person in that moment, rather than pain inflicted on them at the hands of others or the pain of life circumstances. There's also a possibility that she did experience suicidal ideation, and the reality of suicidal ideation is that it's not a binary, it's here or it isn't here for people. Really, people who've experienced suicidal ideation and suicidal thoughts are all over the spectrum of, I would never do that, to I'm seriously considering it. Some suicidal ideation is a result of intrusive thoughts, and they may not really be a reflection of that person's mental state. But alcohol is also a depressant, and it can exacerbate mental illness and things like suicidal thoughts. Someone with goals and plans and dreams can still be struggling with suicidal ideation. The reason I bring this up is because of how it is explicitly talked about in both Tyler and Janice's books about how they do not believe that Amy was suicidal when she died. And while she may not have wanted to die, she was told the consequences of her drinking and ill health and was convinced that nothing would happen to her. So even if it isn't being suicidal as we know it, she felt powerless to change her coping mechanisms and unhappy with her life. Amy loved to sing, but Amy is someone who publicly expressed her performance anxiety and how she would need a few drinks to get on stage and loosen up. This is such a fast decline for someone struggling with anxiety because of how alcohol will give us a false impression of ourselves and others. When we start needing alcohol for social events like performing, or for an interview to get the conversation going, or for a pick-me-up to get me through the day, it adds up really fast. Personally, I used to think that I could only be fun or normal in social settings when I was drinking, because otherwise my anxiety, my insecurities would get in the way and keep me disengaged and reluctant to contribute. I liked myself better when I'd had a few drinks. It happens so quickly that addiction becomes a reality because the underlying cause that's being treated doesn't go away. For people who self-medicate to feel better around others, to feel more creative, more intelligent, it can feel like the only way that you're social, creative, or intelligent is when you're not sober. A healthy relationship with alcohol is also really complicated because alcoholism has a genetic component, but it's also so stigmatized to discuss that a family member who is struggling is more likely to hide it or have it hidden by others around them in order to avoid scrutiny. So for a lot of people, they don't know that they have an addiction history in their family or whether or not they're at risk themselves. For Tyler specifically, in his book, he talks about how he knew he had a family history of alcoholism, but that he felt he had his drinking under control until he was assaulted in 2004 in a mugging. What I wish we would have seen explored was how much Amy struggled to perform each time she got on stage, and how she came to the stage in spite of those fears. What did she have to do to reach down into herself and pull out that light? How did that become a cycle of abuse? I would love to know if she faced the same issues when filming music videos or when she was being photographed for magazines. Mostly because when you see the end product, my question is, how did she get there? She nails it. She looks amazing. She has a great expression on her face at all times. But how did she get to the point where she loses the insecurity enough in front of the camera to pull it off? In the movie, there's one scene where her management asks her to stop playing the guitar when she performs because her stage presence is negatively affected by it, and she's blocking herself off from the crowd with the guitar. She gets angry and walks out, telling her manager Nick later that she's so anxious every time she gets on stage, it doesn't help to hear from her team that she has no stage presence. Now, this is a case where they had to tell us rather than show us that she felt anxious because they didn't show us, and they don't bring it up again in the movie. Amy was also a perfectionist who was not happy with the final version of her debut album, but the label had to put their foot down and cut off her tweaking and editing it because of how much she would go back and forth and how there were times where they were totally unable to reach her. Tyler's book describes the recording and release of Frank as some of their happiest moments. She was being paid to make music, she was able to live on her own and even live with her friend Julieta without charging rent, and she would wake up early to tidy up and get flowers from Camden Market, go to a tanning bed. She was fiercely independent, and while the structure of tour life and performances did bother her, she was also doing what she loved. Her and Tyler would even write and record songs together like Best for Me, which is a great song that you should go listen to. It was after the promotional tour for Frank that all the chaos and constant motion abruptly ended, and suddenly she was in her Camden flat again with nothing to do but write the next album. And it was a huge struggle for her that took 2 years, and the inspiration for that album came from the relationship that she had with Blake Fielder-Silvo. When Amy met Blake, they were both seeing other people. She told Tyler that she knew he was doing heroin and coke, but that he'd been through a lot in his life that led her to understand and want to become closer to him. She also told Tyler that she knew he was with someone else, so that plus the drugs meant that they could never be together, but that didn't stop them from spending all their time together. Amy was practically living with Blake at her flat in Jeffrey's Place, where he would do coke and heroin with his friends while she sat by. According to Tyler at that time, she preferred drinking and smoking weed, so she wouldn't join in, but she wanted him around all the time, so she didn't mind if he did it in front of her. They were together for less than a year before they broke up, with him going back to the woman that he was seeing before Amy. This really pushed Amy emotionally, and while it inspired Back to Black, it also began a spiral where her drinking became so problematic that her friends and manager confronted her about it. Her manager at the time, Nick Shymansky, asked her to go to rehab, and she agreed to go. This is the way Tyler says it went down, that Nick drove her far out somewhere to talk and convinced her to go to rehab. Mitch has a different story. He stated that his wife Jane was the one to convince Amy she needed to go to rehab. Amy was staying in his home for a few days after she was hospitalized for a head injury that she sustained after a night of drinking. Amy's friend Lauren had taken her to the hospital, and Mitch rang up Amy's managers to discuss her drinking. But she spent about 3 hours with their intake psychologist, and then decided not to stay. However, only Mitch's book states that she spent 3 hours with a counselor. Tyler's book states that she spent about 20 minutes there. And Janice wrote that Amy only spent 15 minutes with a counselor before calling Nick again and leaving. Both Janice and Tyler could be speaking hyperbolically, as she was meant to stay for a week, but didn't. This is one of those things where only Amy or Nick Shymansky would be able to tell us how much time she spent there, but it's also an example of how three people who are close to her can tell the same story differently. Mitch says that she stayed for 3 hours and told him after that she didn't like the psychologist she spoke with. Mitch says he later learned that the psychologist had told her she would need to stay for 2 months, which must have been what deterred her, but we don't find out how he learned that. Amy told both her parents that the doctor just talked about himself. She told Tyler that the doctor was some prick trying to tell her how she felt, and that she didn't think she had a problem. And because her and Tyler were partying together heavily at the time, he also didn't think that it was that serious either. She decided not to renew her management contract with Nick after this, and then she chose promoter Ray Cosbert as her new manager. They were never as close, her and Ray, as she was with Nick, so she felt like that distance would be good for her to retain her independence. Back to Black was released in October of 2006, and its commercial success quickly surpassed Frank. It was an international hit, with its biggest singles being Rehab and Back to Black, and the songs were so autobiographical that they opened Amy up to very personal questions regarding her drinking and her relationships, and there were many times in interviews where she was put on the defensive as the result of questions that were fairly personal, right? Like, she wrote a lot of personal songs. She got a lot of personal questions.
I guess especially with the drinking in particular, it's one of those things where it's like, do you have to worry about drinking in public or drinking at social events, or
what's drinking got to do with it?
Well, because when Rehab came out and there was all this speculation about your performances and how much does she drink and how much does it, and all the interviews, is that something that actually mattered to you in your public persona?
Nah.
No.
There are interviews in 2006 where she describes herself as not an alcoholic and an alcoholic, which to me is indicative of the immense struggle she faced. In one interview, she talks about the song Rehab and how when she agreed to go initially, the doctor telling her she had a problem pissed her off when she knew that she drank as hard as her management did, and that they wanted her to sober up just long enough to work while they partied as usual. A common thread in Tyler's book is Amy becoming invincible in her own eyes. As her music gained international attention and the general public had a heightened awareness of her, not only was her life completely invaded, but any sense of normalcy was gone. She no longer suffered consequences for actions like smoking on a commercial flight, bringing weed to Norway and lighting up in a hotel room, punching people, or purposefully smashing glasses in a bar. Tyler was always mortified for Amy in these instances, but was met with Amy's nonchalance. In all of these instances, the worst Amy dealt with was paying a fine. Other times where she felt she had grown invincible were times when she had fallen into a coma, had seizures, or extreme trouble breathing, but was brought back to health in a few days. Tyler felt that because every time she ended up in the hospital she felt fine afterwards, she started believing that there would never be a time where her health couldn't be restored. This is in addition to health issues that could potentially alter her ability to sing. Amy and Blake got back together in 2007 and eloped in Miami in the same year, much to the dismay of her family. She actually had family living in Miami at the time too, but they were also not made aware of the marriage until later. It's incredibly frustrating and sad that Amy Winehouse did not have the luxury of dealing with her struggles privately. And worse yet, the fact that someone who is struggling can be made into a cash grab and entertainment special the way it has been is insane. Tyler James had this to say about Amy dealing with alcoholism and who she turned into while under the influence. When someone reaches this level of alcoholism, they turn into somebody else. Really somebody else. Like they're possessed by an actual demon. I called this person the other Amy. I hated that person. She'd have me up all night. She'd come down the stairs and kick my bedroom door open. It could be 3 a.m. I'm asleep and she'd be screaming my name. When Tyler's best friend would turn into the other Amy, he was helpless. He knew that the person in front of him wasn't who Amy really was, but that same person was still the one lashing out and hurting him, and hurting herself. This other Amy also became the basis for the caricature of Amy Winehouse that was published so often in tabloids like News of the World. I think that while the tabloid press were a bunch of assholes and evil fucks, Amy Winehouse was a person who was already struggling before her first album was released and before tabloids were hounding her. There was something inside her that she was attempting to fix or change that contributed to substance abuse. The immense public scrutiny and tabloid press exacerbated a bad situation for sure, and really took advantage of someone who needed help, in a similar manner to Britney Spears. There was a lot changed in the movie regarding Blake. A big change that's been brought up is Amy's introduction to crack and heroin, which is shown on screen as something that she does alone after the recording of Back to Black. Then there's a scene where Blake's dealer tells him he should get back together with Amy so he could pay off his debts. And after that scene, they do get back together, but we never see Blake taking money from her or doing anything like, for example, recording videos and taking photos of her doing drugs to sell to the press. Things he actually did. One of the more famous scandals that came about from Blake selling videos of Amy to the press was a video he filmed asking Amy to sing a racist song for him. It was evident from her surroundings in the video that everyone involved was under the influence. She apologized in the press for this, but rightfully received a backlash for singing the song in the first place. Another was a video one of Blake's friends had recorded and sold of her smoking crack. Tyler talked about this instance in his book. She was having a party in her Camden flat when Tyler noticed a guest wearing a camera on a necklace. He confronted him and was ignored, so he went to tell Amy. Her response was that they were cool because they were with Blake. Amy would rationalize these instances where it was obvious Blake had sold stories or videos of Amy to the press by saying that she knew Blake just wanted to have his own money. She rationalized a lot of bad behavior from Blake. Tyler wrote about one birthday when he tried to take Amy to a birthday party he put together for her. She answered the door to her hotel room with a busted lip, and Tyler was sure it must have been from Blake. Amy begged him not to do anything and to leave. And she never made it to the party. I would say the movie touched on this a bit when they showed Blake with scratches on him, but they didn't go as far as to show Blake being the one to physically hurt Amy, which feels like a choice considering that this is talked about in 2 of the 3 books, and the director must have read one of them at a minimum considering the information in the movie. This is where Tyler does implicate Blake as an abuser, and while it was not ever something that Amy talked about herself, there are also several paparazzi photos of Blake and Amy scratched up and bloody. It seemed like when they were high together, they would get into these violent fights, but no one, not Tyler, Mitch, or Janice at least, could say what was happening between them, and Amy did not let them know. What Amy did do was call Tyler when Blake left the room, but quickly hang up on him in the middle of a sentence when he walked back in. There was also a controlling aspect to their relationship where she submitted to him entirely and spent most of her time with him. She blew off a music video shoot because Blake didn't want to go. She wouldn't turn up to events or performances because Blake would tell her not to. One time, Amy was invited to sing with Prince and hung out with him backstage with Blake and Tyler. Everything felt like a dream until later that night when Blake bragged about stealing money that he'd found in Prince's dressing room. Prince's security thought that the visual director of the tour and mutual friend of theirs named Phil had stolen the money, and his security beat him up and threw him out of the venue. When Amy heard Blake talking about the stolen money, she was embarrassed, but didn't say anything to Blake. She instead called Prince the next day to apologize for having taken the money. Mitch wrote that at one point Amy had told him, "I know Blake manipulates me, Dad, but I kinda like it, and I know I have to stop." He even demanded money from her in their divorce settlement, but eventually dropped that claim in exchange for Amy's family dropping a lawsuit against his parents for copyright infringement, because his mother had published letters that Amy had written him. The extremely tumultuous relationship between their families, Blake's family, Amy's family, was totally left out. Blake's parents, according to Mitch, did not like Amy and often spoke to the press about how she was a bad influence on Blake. Mitch would often fire back on Blake's parents in the press, much to the dismay of Amy, and in his book he describes coming to blows with his parents and his brother when they showed up at her place to accuse him of setting up Blake to go to prison. Blake was first charged with the grievous bodily harm of a pub owner and later charged with perverting the course of justice after Blake attempted to pay off the pub owner to prevent him from testifying. I think the focus on Amy and Blake was a really superficial look at their relationship. Just like in the 2022 Elvis movie, I feel like this movie tried so hard in matching up every performance and costume and makeup detail to copy the original and compare frame by frame, but failed to capture emotions that might have been present there. And the mimicry rings hollow to me, especially when we have footage of Amy in the Amy documentary recording the song Back to Black, where she's fine singing it in one take and laughing about how it sounds sad at the end, versus in the movie where the actress is straining every muscle in her face and forcing out tears.
We only say goodbye with words. I died 100 times. You go back to her and I go back to black. He's killed me. We only said goodbye with words. I died 100 times. You go back to her and I go back to black.
Oh, it's a bit upsetting at the end, isn't it? Oh, boom, boom, boom.
Yeah! Like, all of a sudden, that's where Sam Taylor Johnson wants to deviate from reality to gaze into what might have been Amy's inner thoughts, and she makes a really cheesy decision. Tyler and Mitch in their books talked about how Back to Black songs like Wake Up Alone and Some Unholy War became too hard for her to sing because of the immense emotion tied to them as they were about Blake. This could have been really poignant to include in a performance scene if the director had not been so beholden to copying existing performance footage. In an interview, Sam Taylor Johnson talks about telling Amy's story through her songs, which in my opinion was not a good move. It felt forced and cheesy to throw in lines of a song right after a story beat, kind of like a big wink and a nudge, as if anything less obvious would go entirely unnoticed. For example, when she's writing What Is It About Men, she writes it after her mom tells her that she has calls from her friend's boyfriend. And Sam could have focused more on the Frank album, considering how it was also inspired by the end of a big relationship for Amy. But she really skipped over it in favor of getting to Back to Black and Blake. For someone who claimed to be using her songs as a guide for the story, Sam left out most of Frank, which would have been instrumental in developing Amy's character. One really great example is the song You Sent Me Flying, which would have been amazing to consider as the other side of Stronger Than Me. So something that goes ignored entirely in the books, even, and this movie, is the fact that her first real relationship happened when she was 17 with a 24-year-old. In You Sent Me Flying, she says, "It served to condition me and smooth out my kinks, despite my frustration for the way he thinks. At least you're attracted to me, which I did not expect. But I've never hated myself or my age so much. You sent me flying when you kicked me to the curb." And then in Stronger Than Me, she says, "You've been here 7 years longer than me." In the movie, we get a scene supposedly of Chris Taylor, the guy who is 7 years older, being pissed about the song for lines like, "Feel like a lady," and "You're my lady boy," and "Are you gay?" But she wrote and performed that song long after he broke up with her. Sam made it seem like she was totally in control in that relationship and she kicked him to the curb, but that's not what happened, and the dynamic of that relationship is pretty worrying. Sam also left out the song You Know I'm No Good from Back to Black, with lyrics like "Upstairs in bed with my ex-boy," "He's in the place but I can't get joy," "Thinking of you in the final throes," "This is when my buzzer goes," "Then you notice little carpet burns," "My stomach drop and my guts churn," "You shrug and it's the worst," "Who truly stuck the knife in first." This song heavily suggests that Amy was cheating on a boyfriend, but that the fact didn't seem to faze him, which in turn hurt Amy. Consider the first line of the chorus, "I cheated myself like I knew I would." It's not "I cheated on you," and you can say it's out of poetic license, but I believe when she says, "I cheated myself like I knew I would," she's saying she hurt herself. She's cheated herself out of the kind of a relationship built on trust rather than deception and pain, and that she's someone who has self-sabotaged in the past. Now, for being a movie called Back to Black, presumably about that era in Amy's life, we see so little of the creation of that album, and we see zero collaborations between her and other artists like Nas, Quincy Jones, Tony Bennett, for example. And she wrote Me and Mr. Jones on that album about Nas, and Tyler says also about an ex-boyfriend, George. Mark Ronson and Salaam Remi are also mentioned only in passing, but Mark doesn't get any screen time or lines, and Salaam gets one. Janice, at one point, talked about how she felt afraid of where Amy's next album inspiration would come from, considering how much pain was the inspiring factor in both of her other albums. Amy was also afraid of psychiatric help and therapy because she felt that her creativity, her success, was tied into her strong emotional highs and lows, which is a sentiment echoed by many artists. It's the idea that you have to be tortured to arrive at your best art, when the most important part is being alive to make it. Janice's book is a little more detached than Mitch or Tyler's, as she dealt with an MS diagnosis that prevented her from being as present in Amy's adult life compared to how she was very present in her childhood. There are moments in her book when she feels really ashamed when Amy calls other women mommy in front of her, because it feels like a dig at Janice for being less present. Mitch's book has some inconsistencies when compared to Tyler and Janice's, the biggest being the recollection of Amy's 2011 performance in Belgrade. At the time, Amy was on a program of medically assisted addiction treatment and taking a medication called Librium for alcohol withdrawals. She had been clean from hard drugs for 2 years and was being treated for alcoholism. In those 2 years, she had been facing severe performance anxiety and still felt that alcohol was the only way to get through a performance. Her Eastern European tour had been scheduled since the beginning of 2011, but Tyler wrote about how she did not want to do another tour, and she'd been more interested in writing songs than performing them. Tyler wrote that any time Amy expressed hesitancy at the tour, her father Mitch would exclaim that the tour would earn her 6 million quid and that she needed to do it. Tyler would then talk to her manager Ray about possibly canceling the tour, and Ray would say the same. She has to do the tour. At that time, Amy's finances were a huge topic of conversation as the years of hospital stays, rehab facilities, lavish spending, rent and mortgage on several properties, and the salaries of her security and the rest of her team drained her account. She also had to pay penalties in the hundreds of thousands of pounds as a result of canceling earlier tours and performances. Even her duet with Tony Bennett gave her so much anxiety that she broke a 3-week stint of sobriety on the day she was recording with him to pull through. Tyler wrote in his book that, just like with the Tony Bennett duet, Amy started drinking before she was set to leave for tour because of her dread surrounding performing. Tyler wrote that Amy was taken on the plane to Serbia while totally passed out after several days of drinking. Meanwhile, Mitch wrote that Amy seemed fine in the days leading up to the tour and only said that she wanted to back out the day before but changed her mind. Mitch says he spoke to Amy before she got on the plane and that she was sober. Tyler wrote that while in Serbia, several hours before the Belgrade concert, he had given her Librium, as was agreed upon by her doctors for her treatment. However, when someone takes Librium, they run the risk of a blackout or death if they drink alcohol while taking it. Mitch and Tyler both wrote in their books that she asked Ray Cosbert for a glass of wine before going on stage, and then he gave it to her. And by the time that she started singing, it was very obvious that she was drunk. Mitch claims that he had no idea how she would have gotten alcohol, even after the sentence before when he stated that he knew Ray gave her a glass of wine. Tyler was furious when he realized what Ray had done, and after the concert he told him that Amy would not be continuing the tour. So Ray canceled the rest of the tour after the performance. It feels like there was so much to work with here in terms of telling a story about Amy Winehouse that required more than reading the lyrics of her songs. Tyler James watched this biopic and responded in an article with The Sun, which is a shit source, I know. And he said that it had many inaccuracies, like her first time trying drugs, for example, and that it left a lot to be desired. He specifically said that Amy would not have wanted a movie made, and that she would have disliked this movie. However, he also mentioned that she wouldn't have wanted any story told about her life, period. Tyler concludes by saying that he wanted a movie about her life because he thought there was a lot to celebrate there. Her mom Janice says something similar in her book. To be fair to the subject of this movie and conversation, it would be wrong to ignore that Amy would not have wanted any telling of her life story, movie or book. Janice wrote that she was approached to write a book about Amy's life in 2007, and that she asked Amy about doing it, and Amy was totally against it. Amy said, "Don't do it, Mom. I don't want people to know about my life." And then Janice wrote that Amy was happy to let the beehive and the eyeliner and the car crash lifestyle become the only side of her the public saw, even though we knew she was a much more complex person than that. I think especially after the intense public scrutiny and stories in the tabloids, she preferred as much privacy as possible. And in one of her earlier interviews, Amy talks about how people want to know more about her, but that once people see I'm only good for the tunes, they aren't going to want to know more.
But you can't do that because you have other responsibilities now. You're becoming an artist in the public eye. So all of a sudden you're going to be, I'm not saying you're going to be hounded by the press, but you're going to have certain responsibilities that are going to come onto your doorstep that you may not particularly want.
Okay, that's cool, but I think the more people see of me, the more they'll realise that all I'm good for is making tunes. So leave me alone and I'll do it. I will do the music. I just need time to do the music, you know what I mean?
And I think she knew herself well. I think that she was aware that she's not for everybody. She knew her flaws, and she didn't expect people to look past them, rather to respect the music she put out and her privacy as a person. Janice talks about a time when Amy told her that she had tried heroin before. Now, she said that she had first tried heroin during the recording of her first album, Frank. And her mother notes that Amy and Blake have both publicly stated that Blake is the one who introduced her to hard drugs, and she doesn't know if Amy was lying to her then or to the public later. I think this means more regarding how people view Blake, who is not a well-liked character in Amy Winehouse's life, and how he's viewed as an evil person who dragged her down. In Janice's book, there's really little blame there, and she kind of leaves it all up to Amy. Tyler's book does have more blame placed on the people in Amy's life, with more than a little ire directed at Mitch, at Ray Cosbert, at Island record executives, and at Blake. But he also talks about how only Amy could have helped Amy, a sentiment repeated across all 3 novels. Tyler had an extremely close view of Amy as he had grown up with her and lived with her for many years, and he was so enmeshed in her life that he also struggled to remain sober after his own addiction issues worsened with cocaine and alcohol. But something he says about the movie in praise is that it doesn't paint Blake as a villain. He doesn't think Blake is a villain. No one in these books particularly likes Blake, but they all know that he wasn't the sole reason for Amy's addictions, and especially not her death. Janice wrote a lot about how the drug resilience programs the Amy Winehouse Foundation had funded are geared toward the understanding of addiction and how a young person is vulnerable to developing addiction as a coping mechanism. She also talks about how there's no general background or issue that contributes to the start of an addiction, and that the most effective thing she's seen happen with these programs is the open discussion of issues young people face and how they handle those issues. She also talks about high-risk behaviors and how young people engaging in a high-risk behavior can be a cry for help, and that it was an early warning sign that she probably should have seen in Amy. Amy's mother is fairly absent in this movie, as well as her closest friends. They're mentioned in passing and shown once or twice, but the biggest characters in this movie are Blake, Mitch, and Cynthia, apart from Amy. I think it's a reductive move, and it's not to Amy's benefit to reduce her life to so few figures. I think Sam, who I don't love as a director, but if that's who it is, then that's who it is, should have chosen a moment in Amy's life rather than attempt to fast forward through a decade like she did. Just like how Baz Luhrmann's Elvis film attempted to fit way too much into the runtime, Back to Black at times felt more like a movie trailer than a movie. I would have loved if the recording of Frank had been the focus of the movie. It's a lesser-known portion of her career that could have contributed something greater to the understanding of Amy as an artist. There could have been a lot of good done here, especially considering how much work Amy's family has put into the Amy Winehouse Foundation to help other young people through addiction treatment, education, and music therapy. There's been a lot of backlash against the ending to the Back to Black movie, and its implication that the knowledge of Blake having a child with another woman is what led to Amy's death. It's something that I think is insulting to a lot of people to put that notion out there that Amy relapsing was the direct result of that information, rather than one of many relapses in the long journey of addiction recovery. She was still struggling with bulimia, she was still struggling with her mental health. She was also in a totally different romantic relationship at the time of her death with a man named Reg Travis, and both of her parents have said that she told him that she loved him, and that she had plans to marry him and start a family. So centering Blake in a movie about Amy seems more than a little cruel. And you don't have to feel any sympathy for this man, but if you're directing a movie about Amy's life, you have a choice in how you portray the people in it. He was a big part of her life, and that's something Amy has said herself, but to act like he was the only important relationship in her life, and the cause of her death, is pretty cruel. There's also the matter of this was a movie done too soon. And yeah, for someone who died in 2011, it does seem fast, in a we need to keep the life rights and make the movie by this date kind of a way. I think it also mythologized her life in a way that ignores how recent it was. Like, this is a woman who had a MySpace account, Facebook, Twitter. She was good friends with Kelly Osbourne and Adele. This was something that happened only 13 years ago, which in the grand scheme of things is not much time. She also had a Yahoo account where she ran a blog dedicated to her favorite vintage movies when she was 17, and it was called Bunny's Vintage Movies, and had frequent posts and interactions with members where she talked about her favorite movies and music. And she even talks about meeting Simon Fuller and being offered her record deals. Something a lot of people have already talked about is the lack of Amy's vocals in this movie. I think anyone would have had a hard time singing Amy Winehouse like Amy Winehouse, but beyond that, finding a jazz singer who was also an actress, who was also super close in resemblance to Amy Winehouse, would be practically impossible. I wish the film had used Amy's vocals because they are incredible, and something that I think was a detriment to the film in terms of presenting Amy Winehouse as an artist was tasking an actress, Marisa Abela, with imitating Amy Winehouse as she was on her albums. Amy was a jazz vocalist who would change up how she sang frequently. Her live performances were always different from her albums because of the way that she could play with notes and sound live. It's a huge talent to sing that way, and a huge part of Amy's performances. But the movie wanted to sound as close as possible to her studio albums. But to be fair to Marisa, she's not a singer, and it took months of training to sound as close as she could to the albums to begin with. So if they were dead set on using Marisa's vocals only, then the easiest option was to just stick to the album. I saw a comment on the trailer on Reddit where someone saw the scene of Marisa singing Stronger Than Me going woo during the breakdown.
You should be stronger than me. 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 Hey, hey, hey!
And it made me laugh because the comment said Amy would have never thrown a woo in there. And it sounds like a joke, but I swear I've tried so hard to find a performance where Amy gave us a woo in a song, and I did not find one.
You should be stronger than me. Yeah, you should be strong. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh, oh, wah, 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 wah. You should be strong, no, 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 than me. Yeah, yeah, yeah. You should be stronger than me. You should be stronger than me. Yeah, you should be stronger than me. Oh, oh, you should be stronger than me. Yeah, you should be stronger than me. Yeah, you should be stronger than me. Yeah, you should be stronger than me. Oh, you should be stronger than me. Oh, you should be stronger than me. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But I could only go through what's online, so maybe one of you, lucky enough to have seen her live, can recall a woo and correct this person. Now I'd like to tell you about some scenes from Tyler James and Janice Winehouse's books that to me were so striking just to read that I would have loved to seen them included in a movie about Amy. So imagine an opening scene where Carole King's So Far Away is playing, and you realize Amy is singing along while sitting on the edge of her bed, waking up Tyler. They are in her house, and she is 17 years old. Tyler wakes up and smiles up at Amy. Her stepfather starts knocking, telling Amy she has to leave soon. Tyler sneaks out the window, and Amy yells back in a huff that she'll be down in a minute. They go off to school separately. Amy keeps humming to herself, and we get a chance to see her room, painted with a mural inspired by Under the Wave off Kanagawa on the wall against her bed. Her guitar's by the desk, her clothes everywhere. She grabs her journal and heads out. So much of the Frank album is already telling a story, and I wish it's one that we would have seen play out on screen. Like the story of how she met Chris Taylor. Now, Chris was the boyfriend who was 7 years older than her and her first real relationship. Their relationship and their breakup is what inspired the Frank album. So, imagine us meeting Chris Taylor. She tells us in Frank that she met him while working for a newspaper. She was a music journalist for WENN, which was owned by her friend's dad at the time. She likes to walk past his desk in heels and try to get his attention. She likes to share her cigarettes with him. She laughs at all of his jokes, all the while not actually knowing if he likes her or not, and then later realizing that, yeah, he did. It's exciting to have this kind of illicit office romance between them, but it's also really exciting to be so young and seeing someone that you think is more mature and also so handsome and in this place where you are so bored all the time and just falling for this person. And you know the feeling of falling for someone. You know the feeling of letting them borrow your favorite CDs and telling them about things that you like. And you also know the feeling of things ending and that heartbreak being so real and all-consuming that you can't even stand to be left with the memories anymore. And you put them all away, pack them up, have your mom drive you down to where he lives, and give it all back. The amazing thing is, shortly after this relationship is when she starts getting the attention of 19 Management, Nick Shymansky and Simon Fuller, and is offered her management deal, which for a 17-year-old, 250,000 pounds being given to you as part of a deal where you get to do exactly what you want to be doing is incredible. You move out with your best friend, you decide to get an apartment together in Camden in the heart of young people in London. And then you get to take all those poems you've been writing and just like shit writings about how horrible breaking up is and turn that into something amazing. And then you also get the opportunity to take that to Miami and go meet a producer who has worked with so many incredible artists and create your own sound. In Miami, Amy stays with Tyler James at a fancy Art Deco hotel called the Raleigh, which is the same one used to film in The Birdcage. Amy's recording in Miami and New Jersey for the Frank album and having the time of her life with Tyler, and for the first time being totally independent, spending money on whatever she wanted to spend money on, and being herself. There are moments in his book, like Tyler impersonating Simon Fuller on the phone to Clive Davis, a huge American music industry bigwig, trying to get him to listen to a song that he wrote called She Doesn't Even Know I'm Alive. Because Tyler is convinced that this song sounds so like Christina Aguilera. It's going to be such a pop hit that Clive Davis needs to listen and get this song out there. So Amy pretends to be Simon Fuller's secretary and tells him, oh, we've got someone here. We've got someone here you need to listen to get Tyler through to Clive Davis. And it works. But Clive Davis never reaches out to them about the song ever again. Now Amy and Tyler are back in London, and it's time to shoot the cover art for the Frank album. Amy is being photographed in a laundromat while Tyler's sitting across the room watching, and Amy has a serious face on. She has a full glam look. She's in a nice dress, she's sitting around, she's crouching, she's posing. The photographer snaps away, and Amy just looks bored. So Tyler calls out that Amy should smile, maybe, and she just flips him off. He laughs, he says maybe that would be a better photo than any of the others they've taken, and Amy's sitting there annoyed because she knows that he's right. None of these photos look like they're her album cover. In fact, Tyler says that it could be any girl in London in these photos. So they ask the photographer to just go out walking in the street with them. Amy changes out of this dress and fancy makeup, and they just go walking down the street. While walking down the street, they come across someone walking two schnauzers, and Amy says, look, T, a schnauzer. Tyler asks that person walking if Amy can walk their dog. They agree. Amy takes the leash with a big smile, and that's when Tyler tells the photographer to start taking photos. And this is where the album cover for Frank comes about. Okay, this last one is a performance scene. Amy performs at Glastonbury in 2004. She's at a small stage and it started to rain. She tells the audience that she's gonna sing something more upbeat and maybe the sun will come out. She sings In My Bed and the crowd cheers. The sun does come out, And when she's done, she notices Tyler high off of his ass, right at the barrier, and calls out to him, laughing that he is covered in mud and rolling super hard right now. That Glastonbury performance is available on YouTube, and I do recommend you watch it because it is incredible. She's just absolutely incredible. But sadly, you do not get to see Tyler high and covered in mud. That's something he just talks about in his book. I would love to know your thoughts on the movie, but mostly I would love to know how Amy's music came into your life and what your thoughts on her legacy are. If you'd like to support the Amy Winehouse Foundation, I will leave links in the description, along with some resources on addiction and eating disorder recovery. Thank you so much for watching, and there's so much more life yet to be lived, so I hope you stick around to do it.